state. So how can these views be, in which encroachment is both detrimental and desirable, be reconciled? To me, answering this question starts with better defining what we really mean by encroachment and appropriation. And the term informality actually collapses a broad range of different processes that need to be entangled. The third thing is that encroachment is structured by scale. The encroachment of previously unsettled land by new houses operates at a higher scale than the encroachment of public space within a neighborhood that is already settled. Higher scale encroachment is indeed an assertion of the rights of the urban poor, a potential tragedy of the rural commons, but it produces urban commons, which are the ones at stake in that lower scale encroachment. Second, lower scale encroachment and affects two different kinds of urban commons. You have access to light at the upper level through cantilevering, and you have encroachment at the ground level through serrations of the public-private interface that affect pedestrian access and social life. Then third, there's a distinction in which appropriation and personalization are in a way extensions of everyday behavior, while encroachment is arguably semi-planned, preconceived to a degree, and involves more investment that kind of raises the stakes before people do it. While personalization is important, I'll leave it out of this discussion because it projects no spatial claim, and I've never left it out of my research framework. And finally, referencing Edward Hall's work on appropriation, he distinguishes semi-fixed appropriation of space by the placement of objects, and the non-fixed appropriation of space by people using public space. And these four fundamentally different kinds of use of public space are going to inform the rest of my presentation today. Now, before we dive into that part, I want to just take a step back and talk about urban villages a bit more broadly. By some estimates, upwards of 80% of contemporary global urbanization can be understood as informal, of which a large share actually consists of the urbanization of erstwhile villages. In fact, in the opening pages of the book Urban Informality, editors Roy and Al-Sayad argue that the illegal subdivision of agricultural land seems to have become the largest source of informal urban development, but that process implies some important breaks with earlier forms of informality. First, rather than the illegal higher scale encroachment of land, the urbanization of villages is characterized by the informal sale of lands with a reasonable sense of security of tenure. Second, rather than settlements that are entirely self-built, the spatiality of urban villages is kind of co-produced through a broad variety of agents, including the local states, village community groups, informal developers, and individual residents as well. And finally, informality is no longer considered synonymous with the urban poor, but is rather a mode of production that can both enable and restrict the upgrading of neighborhoods. And it thus decouples the concept of slum from that of informality. So while the term urban village can be applied in a number of ways, urban villages in this context are defined as erstwhile rural villages that are enveloped by the city and through their interaction with that city undergo a transformation process, which consists of two distinct components. They undergo a spatial transformation from low to high density urban environments, and they convert agricultural land to new village extensions. Urban villages also undergo a social transformation as rural customs are transformed into or juxtaposed by a new formal urban governance. And migrants that come to the city often end up living in urban villages that are the only affordable place for them to find a residence. And the native villagers themselves transform from farmers into landlords. The transformation of urban villages kind of resonates to a much broader context of the transformation of traditional forms of governance to what Weber calls the legal rational authority structure, supported by a state bureaucracy. And Douglas North actually defines informal institutions in that way as the self-enforcing constraints to power, such as traditional customs and norms of behavior. And what makes them informal is that they're both uncodified and enforced largely outside of officially sanctioned channels. And this kind of transformation also kind of maps onto Elinor Ostrom's critique of the tragedy of urban commons, in which she argues that traditional community governance of commons is more effective actually than state control mechanisms that have very high transaction costs. So, well, this kind of theory of informality is often a bit detached from the built environment. Howard Davis, in his great book, has actually applied this concept to the built form by his use of the concept building culture, which he defines as the coordinated system of knowledge, rules, and procedures that is shared by the people who participate in the building activity, and that is shared and that determines the form buildings and cities take. And according to Davis, these practices take kind of three distinct forms. One are the uncodified social constraints. One is common law based on customs, and the other are explicit codes. And within this kind of threefold distinction are embedded three different interpretations of what it means to be informal. One is informality as illegality that operates according to a logic of control and subversion of that control. The second interpretation is that of informality as traditionality that operates along a logic of mutual coordination and community governance. And finally, there's informality as incrementality, which operates according to a logic of emergence where outcomes are reached by market mechanisms. So what I'll do in the subsequent part of this presentation is to look at those four different kinds of encroachment and ask, well, how are they mediated by these three different kinds of practices? And are they indeed able to avert a tragedy of the commons? As I mentioned, this is a broader research by my PhD, and I looked at a range of scales, but I'll focus here only on the transect scale, which is a slice across the village, 150 meters wide, that covers both the old core of the village and any new extensions that have been built by the villagers. So in this research, I investigated 12 urban villages in total in 4 different cities, namely Beijing, Guangzhou, Delhi, and Bangalore. And in each city, 3 villages were selected in progressive stages of urbanization, from a village in the outer periphery at the bottom to one that is fully enveloped by the formal city at the top. But for the sake of brevity, I'll just talk about Guangzhou and Delhi in this presentation. But if you want, you can ask questions about Beijing or Bangalore as well. I got the maps within the presentation. So let's start with cantilevering. Anyone familiar with informal settlement will know that cantilevering is pervasive, yet it's something that is largely missing from research into informality, which I think is partly so because it falls under this uneasy problem of overdevelopment, which is this contradictory process in which upgrading leads to slumification. And it is so pervasive because cantilevering increases floor space without extra land acquisition. On small plots, especially, cantilevers can add 10 to 15% of extra floor space. And this capacity for extra floor space, which can be rented out for extra income, is balanced against the public space's capacity to continue to provide light and support the social functioning of public space. And so based on detailed surveys, I mapped the transects according to whether they have any cantilevers and whether the public space below them is entunneled. So this slide shows the degree of cantilevering in Guangzhou. The village closest to the city center is on top, and the village furthest out is at the bottom. And the blue bars indicate whether it is the old core or new extensions. So the dark blue is the old core, and the lighter blue are new extensions. In the inner village of Guangzhou, most laneways have cantilevers, and while about 40% of the public space network is kind of cast in permanent darkness. The old core of the middle village shows a similar pattern, but its new extensions are characterized by cantilevering without tunneling, as can be seen also in this photo. The village committee here has regulated that every building can only cantilever on two sides. And so they've averted that possibility of that tragedy of the commons through community organization. The inner village in Delhi shows a kind of remarkably similar pattern as in Guangzhou, where cantilevers are prevalent, and about 40% again of the laneways are in tunnels. Yet the laneway network is not as fine-grained as it is in Guangzhou, and houses actually traditionally here had courtyards for access to light, as can still be seen in the outer village. But as the village densifies, these are gradually filled in, and buildings increasingly rely on the public space to provide light. But this capacity is increasingly restricted, and in the inner village, you actually see the re-emergence of light wells, which bring light into the house, but it doesn't have the same social functions as the courtyards used to have. And the laneways of the new extensions are generally wider, and cantilever here is very prevalent, but it rarely leads to tunneling. So that's Beijing and Bangalore. I'll skip that for now. So what practices mediate cantilevering? In the absence of formal codes, which only really pertain to building height and not to cantilevering, this village-led organization in Guangzhou has kind of effectively controlled cantilevering in new extensions. But both cases also show emerging performative rules that mediate a kind of system of air rights above public space. And villagers typically follow unspoken rules that limit cantilevering either at a maximum of 1 meter, or sometimes you might hear a third of the laneway, or in some cases it's closely linked to where the entrance of the building is. But perhaps even more important than these are the cultural norms, in the sense that every region has their own building tradition that may or may not include cantilevering. And these set important precedents for the subsequent cantilevering as a village urbanizes. So these cantilevers are built, of course, by the villagers, but once they're built, they kind of exert an independent agency towards public life in villages. So this next section relies on well-known methodologies developed by William White and Jan Gill, studies of public life, but are adapted to the context of informal urbanity. And public life here is distinguished in 3 primary activities: stationary use, transient use, and exchange in public space. And these were mapped for each village in a time frame from 3 to 5 p.m. to reveal how public life transforms as a village urbanizes. So this is Guangzhou again, and you can clearly see here that public life increases with urbanization. While in the outer village, only about 100 people are simultaneously in public space, there's about a 4-fold increase in the middle and inner villages. A kind of movement economy emerges, in which crowding and shopping happens along the most integrated laneways of the village. But when looking closer at the kind of use, there's an important shift that you can see here. While in the outer village, stationary uses, social engagement accounts for almost 80% of all activity, in the inner village, this has dropped to just 35%. So as the village urbanizes, the laneways are increasingly spaces of movement and decreasingly spaces to linger and to socialize. And another notable aspect of the way public life is organized in Guangzhou is that it's very much oriented towards the geographical center of the village. often clustered around the ancestral hall and sometimes market buildings that are kind of secluded from the gaze of the formal city. Now, public life in Delhi's urban villages follows a very similar trajectory as Guangzhou, with increasing intensity of public life and the shift from stationary use to transient use. What stands out in contrast, though, to Guangzhou is that the stationary use of public space is much more distributed, which we'll see is linked to the way that ground floor encroachment actually happened in Delhi. Another significant difference that you can see is the relationship with the formal city. While in Guangzhou, public life was secluded at the center of the village, in Delhi, public life actually intensifies towards the edge of the village and the formal city. So what's at stake here is not only the direct consequences of the kind of impoverished street life, but also indirect consequences of the village capacity to self-regulate. Through the daily use of public space, residents automatically partake in this kind of tactile form of monitoring, whereby using and appraising public space are kind of collapsed into the same activity. When residents are confronted by new activities or appropriations, encroachments that impede or limit their ability to move to socialized exchange in public space, they automatically evaluate them. And they either adjust their own daily rhythm or they speak out and they challenge such new encroachment and appropriation. And that's a typical street in Delhi. And that's Beijing and Bangalore again. So what practices mediate public life? The most important is the emergent performative rules in which cantilevering and tunnels laneways and lessens their role as social space, in the way that shops cluster around a few select laneways that then attract large crowds that move through them. And the contrast between Delhi and Guangzhou is perhaps best understood in cultural terms, with the institution of the ancestral hall in Guangzhou as a key reason behind the clustering of public life. And formal codes such as the hukou system, a residence permit system, kind of contributes to that. Perhaps we'll come back to that later. Yet within the same village, there's also much differentiation between different laneways. And to understand why some are highly social spaces and others are not, we'll turn to the third part, which is to look at these ground floor encroachments. So encroachment on the ground floor negotiates the socio-spatial zone that is known as the public-private interface. Which in research on formal cities are often assessed on their capacity to activate street life. And this activation fundamentally consists of two components, namely the presence of entrances, captured by the degree of permeability, and the degree of serration of an interface. So in the mapping, any interfaces without access, including compound walls, were mapped as non-permeable and non-serrated. And then permeable but non-serrated edges are orange and are flush along the entire length of the ground floor, while the red indicates interfaces that are both permeable and serrated and have the highest capacity for social life. So these maps show that serrated edges actually don't increase or not continue to increase as a village urbanizes, as was the case with cantilevering. Laneways are often too narrow to extend much into public space without limiting access of them. But it also lacks a distinct trajectory because there's simultaneous forces at play that both produce and consume these serrated edges. These edges are the easiest way to extend the house into the public space. But then when more funds become available, those spaces are also the easiest to then reappropriate and reclaim as part of the house. While the outer village still has quite a substantial length of non-permeable interfaces indicated by the cyan, these almost completely disappear as the village urbanizes. Yet it is interesting that even in the densest village, these kind of backsides do remain. which lack both entrances and cantilevering, showing that these kind of traditional norms of orientation of the house continue to structure urban villages well after they've been urbanized. Now, Delhi shows the same tendency of non-permeable interfaces that disappear gradually as the village urbanizes. But then there's an important contrast with Guangzhou in the way that serrated edges are distributed. There are far more of them and they're more dispersed. And this is an important reason also why the public life in these villages differs so much. And a key reason why this is so in Delhi is because of the incremental upgrading of waste and stormwater gutters. Rural villages typically use the same drainage system for carrying both waste and stormwater. And these serrated edges emerge as these open gutters are gradually transformed and covered up, but still retain that high difference between the level of the laneway and that where the house starts. So that's Beijing and Bangalore. So in this dense environment of the urban village, there's this negotiation between the capacity for social interaction through these ground level projections into public space and the capacity for movement along it. And this performative rule is really the key mediating practice for encroachment into public space. Because while encroachment in Delhi are actually formally prohibited, they don't really seem to have any effect. What is interesting in Guangzhou, though, that there is a formal code on plot size, which in a way restricts some of that ground floor serrations. So there's a way that the formal codes do in fact have a clear impact. However, I think far more critical are again these cultural norms, and in the way that each region has their own tradition of serrated edges at the ground floor. And here, you can see that Delhi has that historical tradition, while Guangzhou largely lacks that. Now, once these serrations are built, they then kind of become the stage upon which the appropriation of semi-fixed objects happens, which are sometimes also called loose parts. So in work by Hall and Rappaport on the kind of micro-cultural dynamics of space, appropriations are defined as semi-fixed features that can be freely arranged to intermediate between the fixed arrangement of permanently built environment and the non-fixed behavior of people. Now, appropriation is kind of said to be ubiquitous and often precedes encroachment, but is that really the case? And I looked at these three types of appropriations in urban villages. So these maps actually show that appropriation in Guangzhou declines as the village urbanizes. The laneways of Guangzhou's inner village are largely devoid of appropriations, as is much of the old core of the middle village. And while much of daily life in the outer village still takes place in public space, Guangzhou's inner village has become much more introverted, again, partly because of the cantilevering. And simultaneously, the increasing gaze of the state restricts a lot of appropriation at the edge between the informal village and the city. Now, along the main through lanes of the village, the commercial appropriation is again negotiated with the movement of people past those goods. Too much appropriation restricts the flow of people and then lowers potential customers. And these small level differences that are provided by the serrated edges that extend into public space provide a kind of tacit limit to how much a household can spill out. I would also like to draw attention to the way in which domestic appropriations in Guangzhou's outer village are very much concentrated in particular laneways. And what happens here, I think, can best be summed up by a quote that one of the villagers told me while interviewing them, in which they said, one person builds and the rest follows. there seems to be kind of informal legitimacy that is over time created when appropriations appear in public space that make it then easier for new appropriations to be kind of added to that existing framework. And there you see some of those appropriations. And then finally, it might be interesting to note that while the Guangzhou's old core has in a way a more informal urban morphology, it's actually the semi-planned village extensions, which you see here on the photos, that have the most informal use, which again demonstrates that the informality at a particular scale doesn't determine any degree of informality at any other scale. Now, unlike Guangzhou, appropriations in Delhi's urban villages actually increase with urbanization. And this kind of largely introverted courtyard life in the outer village gradually transforms to one that is more exercised in public space. And the commercial appropriations very much follow a similar logic as in Guangzhou. But domestic appropriations are very much structured by the socio-economic stratification of Delhi's urban villages, primarily through plot size. So you can see that domestic appropriations appear primarily along the smaller plots that are owned by the urban poor, in which a lack of private open space kind of compels them to extend into public space, predominantly for kind of wet appropriations. And it may also be noted, looking at these maps, is that similar as in Guangzhou, the new village extensions are actually primarily used as appropriations for parking, which again kind of dispels this notion that informality is synonymous with the urban poor. And also some images of the appropriations in Delhi. And that's again Beijing, and then we got Bangalore. So if you frame again appropriations within this dynamic of different practices in public space, we can say that appropriation of urban villages is largely independent of formal codes, apart perhaps from the way the gaze of the state restricts appropriations at the edge of the village. And appropriation is much more self-organized with respect to these performative rules through the logic of movement economies and through the affordances that are generated by serrated edges and cantilevering. And the kind of clustering of distinct type of appropriations is very much kind of co-produced through these cultural norms in which this kind of informal legitimacy is generated that make some laneways very much a domestic space and others very much a commercial space. There's relatively little mixing of those. So to conclude, I'm just gonna take the same diagram, but reflect in a slightly broader sense about the kinds of practices that structure laneways in urban villages. Now, the typical kind of modernization narrative that is often, that urban villages are often framed against is indicated by the red arrows. So, this would tell that performative rules kind of form around basic human needs that gradually consolidate into cultural norms that are then kind of rationalized into formal codes, and kind of informality will disappear. But what I found in my own research is that there's also very much the opposite tendency indicated by the cyan colors. So while the old core was traditionally governed by cultural norms, the increased densification kind of breaks these norms down, and they become increasingly mediated by these performative rules. New extensions, on the other hand, are often planned either by some formal codifications or in response to formal codes. But these actually are becoming increasingly governed by cultural norms as traditional practices are adapted to this new space of new extensions. So there's multiple narratives that kind of run through each other, and the idea that urban villages will just eventually disappear and be completely integrated within the formal city is, I think, something that won't happen. So final slide here, returning to the two images of the laneway ballet that I started this presentation with. I now hope that I've kind of elucidated a little bit about the dynamics that operate in such laneways. So while encroachment and appropriation have become common tropes of informal urbanization, I've demonstrated that public space is not actually ceaselessly encroached, but that it's structured through this kind of complex interplay of formal codes, cultural norms, and performative rules. And critically, I think, is that public space is simultaneously the resource that's at stake here that we're concerned about, but it's also the arena in which disputes over that use of public space is mediated. And encroachment and appropriation can simultaneously both add to improve the street life in urban villages, but it can also harm it. It's not a neither or positive or negative thing. To me, at least, averting the tragedy of the commons in these places cannot possibly rely on any of these practices on its own, and will probably happen through a combination of them that will differ depending on the stage of the urbanization in which the village is, and also at particular scales at which some practices work better than others. That was the end of my presentation. I saw that the chat box had some comments already, so I'm not sure whether Roberto wants to lead the Q&A session.
Sorry, I was trying to find a way to unmute myself. I think,
should I stop the share as well, or you think it's useful to keep it on?
Maybe not. Just keep it on. Let's see if people have questions, so you can go back to some slides. So everyone, this is the moment to ask questions and to make comments. There are some comments already in the chat. I don't know, Greg, would you like to comment and give us your view?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Matthijs. This was really interesting. And I thought it was very clever of you to focus on the two. That still gives the contrast without trying to do all the four, but really interesting to see these maps. It looks fascinating. I just wrote something which are two things. One was a kind of reference which might be useful, even though it's not about urban villages per se, but it's this idea of the fixed use. It's like these lanes that are seen, as kind of planners and that as a space to move through, and yet as the shop owners as a place to put things. And there was a big problem in Singapore with the 5-foot way, what they used to call the verandas. There were actually riots about this in the 1880s, and then more riots when they tried to introduce back lanes for hygiene and sanitation. So you might find that an interesting reference to see, the different mindsets about the use or perception of the space. But that led to my question, which is, you've got India and China, and I think they're really interesting to contrast. But India, I'm not sure in the villages, but may have an ethos from the British colonial era and a certain way of doing things, which is kind of more European in its traditions, versus China, which tends to organize through people, the hukou and so on. These spaces seem very similar. Have you seen differences in how they're actually reacted to or how they're appropriated, given you're looking at China and India?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question, Greg. I would probably say two things about that. The first is that I looked at 4 cities, and what I found is that there's probably bigger differences between within countries, between Guangzhou and Beijing, and between Delhi and Bangalore. Delhi and Guangzhou are very similar, and that partly has to do with the way in which villages in Guangzhou operate within a very clear set of legal constraints, in which they have a fixed amount of land upon which they're allowed to build and manage. And so there's a very clear distinction between, let's say, formal and informal. Similarly, in Delhi, the institution of the Lal Dora, which was implemented by the British, provides that kind of relatively clear-cut distinction. So in general, that kind of outer boundary has led to this increased densification and this kind of similar laneway culture that is a bit different in Bangalore and Beijing, where the edges of the village are typically much more blurry. That's the first thing that I want to say about that. The other thing that I want to say about it was well, perhaps I'll just leave it at that. I mean, yeah.
I think it's fine because we do have a few more questions.
Yeah, I should have rambled on too long.
Paul Rabe, I don't know if you would like to say your question or if we can read it.
I can elaborate a bit more. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thanks, Matthijs, for a nice presentation. Yeah, just to play devil's advocate here a little bit on your use of the word or the term tragedy of the commons. I see where you're coming from, but as I wrote in the note, I'd just like to challenge that a little bit. First of all, what are you considering as a commons? The lane is a commons, and the space that people are appropriating does not belong to them. I guess maybe from a setback point of view, that could be correct, but when people are building up, is that not their space? So that's one challenge. But then I guess I'm not from a built environment discipline, so maybe I'm a minority in this group, but from a political science perspective, we could argue that these villages are a success, right? So I don't see the tragedy here so much. People live here, they can find affordable housing here, they find a space to live, to do their business. If we look at it a bit more broadly, what is the tragedy here? So maybe you can just expand on those two.
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree with you. These urban villages are in a way a success, and in many ways, especially in Guangzhou, the way the city has developed, and in Shenzhen equally, it's the urban villages that have made it possible, and equally so in Delhi. If you look at statistics, cities in India that have a lot of urban villages tend to have lesser slums. Now that's a very kind of broad, it's not a causal thing per se, but it is an interesting correlation. I'm trying to find the photo that I wanted to talk about. Here it is, of course, when I introduce it. So typically research on urban villages focuses on the ones in the city center, and this kind of entunneled laneway is fairly typical of that. And I would definitely say that this is a tragedy of the commons. These spaces are dark, they're fairly unpleasant. There's no people using these spaces. And as I've argued, I feel that it has another impact in the way that it kind of makes it difficult for the village to self-organize and self-regulate some other aspects of public space. And of course, the danger is that a lot of the villages that are still in the urban periphery, well, what's going to happen to them in the next 10, 20 years? Because if they're going to follow the same trajectory as some of those in the inner city, then we got a possible tragedy of the commons on our hands. So that's kind of that's how I respond to that. The other thing that I would briefly say about the commons is, because I'm looking at two different countries and two different cities within each country, commons are defined a little bit differently. As a broad generalization, you might say that commons in China are an institutionalized commons, where they're actually collectively owned. And in India, you might talk more about a kind of de facto commons, where everyone wants to own a private piece of land because you can build and live there and have rental income. But no one really wants to own public space because it's only a maintenance issue that you got to pay for. So it becomes this kind of de facto public space that is necessary to the people in the community, but that no one really wants to take a leading role in responsibility. yeah, I hope that answers your question a little bit. We can talk more about it later.
Oh, maybe if you don't mind, we will go forward and we can come back to your question later on.
Sure, thank you.
We have a question from Verena Balt. She asked me to read it. She asks, how did you analyze the relations between rules, norms, and codes?
So the methodology I used was, you know, because of the language barrier, primarily through observations, and a lot of the cultural norms, you know, were kind of taught to me by the interviews that I did with the villagers, with a number of translators that were, you know, helped me throughout all these 4 cities. So in a way, a cultural norm is something that is that the people speak about, that is kind of sort of common knowledge among the community. So that's how I define that. Well, a performative rule is largely unspoken. So it's something that people do, but they're kind of doing it unconsciously. So that's how that is defined. And a formal code is simply, I did quite an extensive looking into all the urban design regulations for all of these cities. So if it was codified in that sense, it counted as a formal code. So that's how I approach those 3 distinct practices.
All right, we have a question from Meng, who is Chinese, by the way. Would you like to ask your question? I can also read it. I'm not sure he's still there. Oh, there he is.
Okay. Oh, I think it's a very interesting and great topic. I mean, because many Chinese scholars try to focus on the urban village because they thought the quality of the space needs to be improved, because normally, like you said, that it's darkness and it can make people feel unsafe, and it causes a lot of, let's say, crimes and many accidents. So it needs a lot of improvement. And I have a quick question about the way that you draw your maps. That how you can draw the maps about I mean, the people, how they use this space. Like I see that there's a map that you show the locations of static people and community people. How you can identify the location? Because for the static people, it's easy because they stand there. But for the people that are passing by, how you can locate, how you can precisely draw their locations?
Yeah, well, thanks, because that's a methodological question which I never get time to talk about in these kind of presentations. So this was basically done through just observation, non-participant observation. And the movement is actually, you know, a fairly well-established methodology of measuring movement of people through public space. I did 5-minute counts for all these laneways. But then the visualization that you see is kind of a distinct choice that I made. There's, well, sometimes you just see these kind of things represented numerically. Another typical technique is to use a kind of gradients technique where intensity of use is indicated with a gradient. But that is difficult if you want to map different kinds of activities. So what I used here is what I call a kind of a snapshot methodology, where the dots that you see are, at least for the transient, the white dots are averages for, you know, on the 5-minute interval. So if you could take an imaginary snapshot of the village, this is how it would, you know, typically look. So that's really a technique that helps me analyze what I see to, you know, is it a more distributed pattern? Is it a more concentrated pattern?
All right. Is that your answer, Meng?
Oh yeah.
Okay, Enrico, your question is pretty straightforward. So if you don't mind, I will just read it. Just a quick thing that I might have missed in the last slide. There was a difference between vernacular and domestic. What was meant with these terms? So what's the difference between vernacular and domestic?
I'm not sure exactly which slide you're referring to. vernacular I would see as a much broader, I would use that also for the kind of cultural norms that existed in these villages traditionally and the kind of buildings they made. And domestic really pertains to household activities spilling out into public space, which I contrast with commercial activities that are geared to production and the sale of goods in public space. Yeah.
All right, we are doing pretty well in terms of time, I have to say, because we do have still quite a few minutes of questions. Our events, they are 1 hour long. Todor, you have a not very straightforward question, which is quite complex. Would you like to ask it?
Yes, I don't know if you see me or hear me.
Yes, we do.
Okay, first of all, thanks, and very, very, very happy to see both of you actually. It was very interesting. I just jumped in the middle, but I have to ask you, I understand, Matthijs, that I don't think that density, so looking on density was that focal point in your research, so I'm not sure how much attention you paid on this, but I'm very curious, and the image that you keep there actually is a good one. I'm very interested to learn whether you figure out that, let's say, if certain density in terms of floors, let's say, if there are some thresholds that could influence the use of public space, like the type of uses, because you said, yes, there is correlation, which is kind of straightforward, but whether the type of uses is influenced also by average height, or because I think you look at average height now most.
Yeah, so well, perhaps I can do another presentation some other time. So I looked at, this is the part you missed, I looked at 3 different scales. I looked at the metropolitan scale, the village scale, and then the transect scale. And the village scale is very much in that domain that you're talking about. So I mapped all the building heights, of course, the figure ground, and then also functional mix. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of a whole story on its own in how that relates to each other. So I might just deflect that question and answer it when I got all the maps with me to show it. I can, if you want, I can share a paper that is under review currently about exactly about this. So yeah, I might just deflect that.
but you look at that, you identified.
I would say there's relatively well, there's a lot of hidden mixed use in urban villages that is difficult to trace. Stuff happening on upper floors, kind of production that is impossible to see. In general, urban villages are predominantly residential places. You got shops that align the most busy streets. What is an interesting thing, though, is that often you see kind of a 2-stage thing where initially the village might develop some industry there or sell the land to an informal developer that builds, a relatively cheap shed to produce something. And then, once more money becomes available, the land prices rise, they demolish that and they build new residential buildings. So in a way, then the money of the industrial production kind of fuels the residential market, which is, the rents you can get for residential use is much, much higher than industrial use. So if it's up to villagers, if they can build residential use, they'll always prefer that.
Okay, we are coming, oh, there is another question. Tule, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, it's actually a very short question. Thank you, Matthijs, for your presentation. It's also very nice to meet you again online. Actually, your presentation also changed my perception towards this informal urbanization, because I used to think it's urban village is quite unique phenomenon in Chinese cities, especially in the Pearl River Delta region, where the urbanization happened very rapidly in cities like Shenzhen. But then after looking at what's happening also in Indian cities, especially you compare them, they're really very similar. So I'm also wondering, is this informal urbanization, is it a very common phenomenon in Indian cities, or it's just in a few cities like?
I would say, I mean, in a way, I'm just tagging along about what Roy and Al-Siyat, which for those who are not familiar with it, wrote probably the most influential book on informality some 20 years ago. They already, assert that the urbanization of rural land is the most important thing, but they kind of forget about, well, who does that land belong to, and who are the people that are actually organizing all this urbanization. And if there's a piece of agricultural land, there's always a village attached to it. I would say in India, it's prevalent. I actually might skip to because I was anticipating a question like this. Skip to this slide at the end, where you can see urban villages at the metropolitan scale in red. They're actually relatively rare in Beijing because of the huge rate of demolition. I would say that most urbanization in India is the urbanization of erstwhile villages. Indonesia is another one with the kampungs that is massive. Cairo is another great example where at least more than half of informal urbanization is the urbanization of fields and the villages that are attached to them. So the way I see it, this is the structuring thing, and that makes it a bit different than urban informality in Latin America, where traditionally...
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Traditionally, population densities weren't very high. There weren't a lot of one of the selection criteria that I used to select my cases was there needed to be what is called in the literature nucleated villages. So these are villages that have a concentrated build-up area where the people don't live on their own agricultural land. So they go out, and there are some, norms of collective organization, collective ownership. If you look at Indian cities that don't have that pattern, that have a dispersed rural settlement pattern, like in Kerala, the urbanization is very different. And I wouldn't call those urban villages. There's just individual farmers living on their own fields that, of course, also develop it, but it never has the same kind of collective thing or doesn't develop in the same kind of density. So yeah, wherever there's nucleated villages and kind of a fast urbanization that kind of, engulfs or overwhelms these rural communities, you get urban villages. That would be my argument.
We are getting very close to the end of our event today. Well, maybe you could answer Kavya's question. Kavya, if you don't mind, I will read it very quickly. Have you noticed any inconsistencies in activities during different times of the day in the same city?
The short answer is no, because I did my activity mapping in a 3 to 5 time interval, because I had to find some way of comparing villages across vastly different contexts. So I had to restrict myself. So I didn't look into that. And, sure, there's differences, when schools go out, just lots of children and moms running around, and in the morning people go to work. So, evidently there is, but I didn't look into that specifically. I might just want to add before Roberto thanks everyone that, if you got any questions or want to get in touch, my email is at the bottom of the slide. There's just my name at gmail.com. So I'm always very happy to talk about that stuff and share research on this.
I guess this answers also our next question, which is about the availability of your thesis online. Maybe Meng or others can contact you.
Yeah, so it's not available online because I'm trying to get it published as a book, so there's kind of copyright issues at play there. But I've got a number of papers coming out soon. Actually, one on encroachments has just been published in Habitat International. So yeah, I'm happy to share that. You can, if you go on my ResearchGate page, all my stuff is there online. So that's probably a better read to my thesis, which is a bit unwieldy, I suppose.
All right, well, exactly on time. It's 1:30 right now here in the Netherlands. Matthijs, it's a pleasure to see you and to see how you have developed into a full-blown intellectual, investigating things that are so dear to a lot of us here in Delft. And I would like to thank everyone for being here today. Please be advised that our events, they happen very frequently, and we always announce them on our Facebook page. We have also a blog that was at the beginning. And I hope to see you all another time. But for now, thank you so much, Matthijs. By the way, it's important, the lecture will be available on our website. You can just go there and watch the lecture. We will take one day more or less to put it there. Thanks a lot, everyone. See you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Roberto.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.